The bustling airport terminal buzzed with activity on a warm summer morning. Flight announcements echoed through the halls as travelers rushed to their gates, dragging suitcases and balancing coffee cups. Near the first-class check-in counter, a well-dressed black family stood organizing their luggage, a distinguished-looking father in a tailored suit, his elegant wife in a cream business dress, and their two teenage children in casual but fashionable attire. A few feet away, a middle-aged woman with highlighted blonde hair and designer sunglasses perched on her head watched them with growing irritation. She had been waiting in line for what felt like ages, though it had only been a few minutes. Her perfectly manicured nails drummed against her designer handbag as she made little huffing sounds, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Can you believe this?" she muttered to the elderly couple standing behind her. "Some people think they own the place." When they didn't respond, she raised her voice slightly. "I mean, really, how long does it take to check in? And look at those bags, probably filled with who knows what." The family at the counter remained focused on their task, the father carefully checking their passports while his wife helped their daughter reorganize a suitcase that had exceeded the weight limit. The son, absorbed in his phone, occasionally helped move bags around as the airline staff member patiently assisted them. The blonde woman's comments grew progressively louder and more pointed. "First class? Really?" she scoffed, making sure her voice carried. "I suppose anyone can dress up and pretend these days. I remember when traveling had certain standards." Several nearby passengers shifted uncomfortably, some shooting disapproving glances her way. A young woman in a business suit took out her earbuds, frowning at the scene unfolding before her. An off-duty pilot walking past slowed his pace, keeping an eye on the situation. The family appeared to be completing their check-in process, with the airline staff member showing nothing but professional courtesy. Their luggage tags clearly displayed first-class markers, and their carry-on items included a leather briefcase and what appeared to be medical documents. Unable to contain herself any longer, the blonde woman stepped out of line, her heels clicking against the terminal floor as she approached the counter. "Excuse me," she said loudly, addressing both the family and the airline staff, "but I've been waiting forever. Don't you think others deserve a turn? I mean, assuming all of this is even legitimate." The father turned slightly, his expression calm but tired, as if he experienced similar situations before. His wife placed a gentle hand on his arm, while their children looked up from their phones, their faces showing a mix of hurt and resignation. Just then, another airline employee walking past stopped abruptly, his face lighting up with recognition. "Doctor," he exclaimed warmly, approaching the family. "I didn't expect to see you here today. How are you?" The blonde woman's expression flickered as the employee continued. "Everyone at the airport knows about your work at Central Hospital. My sister was one of your patients last month, the emergency valve replacement. She's doing wonderfully now, thanks to you." The doctor smiled warmly, extending his hand to shake the employees. "I'm so glad to hear that. Please tell her to keep up with her follow-up appointments." Other passengers in line began to whisper and point, some pulling out their phones. One woman gasped softly and said to her companion, "That's the doctor who was just on the morning news, the one who performed that groundbreaking surgery on the governor." The blonde woman's face had turned a deep shade of red. She took a step back, then another, her earlier confidence evaporating as more details about the family emerged from various conversations around her. The doctor's wife, it turned out, was a prominent attorney who had won several landmark civil rights cases. Their children were both honor students involved in community service projects. The airline staff member finishing their check-in looked directly at the blonde woman and said firmly, "Your turn, ma'am," her tone professional but cool. Several passengers who had witnessed the scene were now openly glaring at the woman, while others shook their heads in disapproval. The doctor's family gathered their remaining belongings with dignity, the father guiding them toward the security checkpoint. As they walked away, other travelers stepped aside respectfully, some offering smiles or nods of recognition. A small child tugged on his mother's sleeve and pointed, saying, "Mom, that's the doctor from the TV." The blonde woman stood frozen, her earlier self-righteousness replaced by visible shame as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. The terminal had grown quieter, with many eyes now fixed on her. The elderly couple she had tried to engage earlier deliberately turned their backs, while others whispered and pointed their phones in her direction. As she stepped up to the counter, her hands shaking slightly while retrieving her ID, the weight of her actions seemed to finally sink in. The doctor and his family had demonstrated grace and professionalism in the face of her prejudice, while she had publicly displayed her bias for all to see. Unknown to her, several witnesses had already begun posting about the incident on social media, their phones capturing her behavior and the dignified response of the family she had targeted. By the time she reached her gate, her actions would be spreading across the internet, serving as yet another example of prejudice confronted by excellence and grace. The doctor's family, meanwhile, made their way through security, their children leaning close to their parents for comfort. The father and mother exchanged a knowing look. This wasn't their first encounter with prejudice, nor would it be their last. But they had long ago chosen to meet such moments with dignity, knowing their achievements and contributions spoke far louder than any ignorant assumptions. As they settled into the first-class lounge, the father received a message from the hospital about an upcoming surgery schedule, while his wife reviewed legal briefs on her tablet. Their children returned to their phones, but now they sat a little closer to their parents, drawing strength from their family's unity in the face of ignorance. The incident would soon become a talking point at the airport and beyond, not because of the blonde woman's behavior, but because of how the family had handled it, with a grace and dignity that transformed an ugly moment into a powerful lesson about prejudice and presumption. The blonde woman couldn't let it go. Even after the humiliating moment at the check-in counter, something drove her to follow the family through the terminal. Her designer heels clicked against the floor as she walked purposefully behind them, maintaining what she thought was a discreet distance. The family had stopped at a coffee shop, the parents ordering drinks while their teenagers browsed through their phones. The woman seized her chance, marching up to their table with false confidence masking her growing discomfort. "I just can't believe they're letting you into first class," she announced loudly, causing nearby coffee drinkers to look up from their cups and newspapers. "I've been flying this airline for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like this." The father set down his coffee cup slowly, exchanging a weary glance with his wife. The teenagers tensed, their phones forgotten as they watched the scene unfold. Other passengers in the coffee shop began to stare, some pulling out their phones to record what was happening. "Ma'am," the father said calmly, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone used to handling difficult situations, "I'm not sure what you're trying to accomplish here, but my family and I would appreciate being left in peace." His wife touched his arm gently, her elegant demeanor unruffled despite the confrontation. The teenagers sat perfectly still, their faces showing a mix of embarrassment and hurt that no young person should have to experience. A barista behind the counter, who had been watching the situation develop, stepped out from behind the register. "Is everything okay over here?" she asked, her name tag gleaming under the coffee shop's lights. "No, everything is not okay," the blonde woman declared, her voice rising. "Do you know how much first-class tickets cost? There's no way they could afford." She was cut off by a sharp gasp from several customers. An older gentleman in a pilot's uniform had approached the table, his face lighting up with recognition. "Doctor, I didn't expect to see you here today. Your team saved my wife's life last month, that emergency bypass surgery. I can't thank you enough." The woman's face began to pale as the pilot continued speaking, detailing the complicated procedure that had saved his wife's life. Other passengers in the coffee shop started whispering, some pointing their phones more openly now. "That's the famous heart surgeon," someone whispered loudly. "He was just honored at the medical conference downtown." "And his wife," another voice added. "She's that civil rights attorney who won that huge case last month." The blonde woman's confidence crumbled as more people joined the conversation, each adding pieces to the puzzle of who this family really was. Her face flushed red as she realized she had not only embarrassed herself once but had doubled down on her mistake. The teenagers, who had been quiet throughout the encounter, straightened in their seats as they saw their parents being recognized and respected. Their earlier discomfort began to fade, replaced by quiet pride. A flight attendant who had been getting coffee noticed the commotion and approached. "Dr. Mrs. Attorney," she said warmly, "we're so honored to have you flying with us today. I read about your recent humanitarian award." The work you're doing with those free clinics is incredible." The blonde woman took a step back, then another, as more people gathered around the family's table. Some shared stories of how the doctor had helped their loved ones, while others praised his wife's legal work fighting for equal rights. The coffee shop had become surprisingly quiet, with all attention focused on the unfolding scene. The family maintained their composure, gratefully accepting the kind words while trying to keep the situation from escalating further. "We should head to our gate," the doctor said quietly to his family, standing up. His wife nodded, gathering their belongings with practiced grace. The teenagers followed suit, standing tall despite the unwanted attention. As they prepared to leave, the pilot turned to the blonde woman, who was now backed against a wall of coffee beans. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "I believe you owe this family an apology." The woman opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. No words came out. The weight of her actions, the public scrutiny, and the revelation of who she had been harassing seemed to finally sink in. A small crowd had gathered, their phones recording every moment. Some were already posting the incident on social media, sharing how a prejudiced woman had tried to harass a prominent family only to learn a powerful lesson about assumptions and bias. The doctor's family moved toward the exit, maintaining their dignity despite the situation. As they walked away, other travelers stepped aside respectfully, some offering apologetic smiles or words of support. The blonde woman stood frozen in the coffee shop, the untouched cup of coffee in her hands growing cold. She watched as the family disappeared into the terminal crowd, their heads held high, their unity unshaken by her attempts to diminish them. Around her, people began to disperse, but not before giving her disapproving looks. The incident would soon spread across social media, not because of her behavior, but because of how the family had handled it, with grace, dignity, and an unwavering sense of self-worth that no amount of prejudice could diminish. The coffee shop slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the atmosphere had changed. Conversations turned to discussions about prejudice, assumptions, and the power of maintaining dignity in the face of ignorance. The blonde woman's actions had inadvertently created a moment of reflection for everyone who witnessed it. The revelation of the family's identity spread through the airport terminal like wildfire. A young airport staff member who had witnessed both confrontations rushed toward the security checkpoint, where several of his colleagues were gathered. "You won't believe what just happened," he said, slightly out of breath. "Remember that heart surgeon who saved the governor? He's here with his family, and this woman just made a complete fool of herself trying to harass them." The security staff listened intently as he described the incidents at the check-in counter and coffee shop. One of the senior security officers shook his head in disbelief. "That doctor saved my nephew last year. Complex heart surgery. The kid wasn't supposed to make it, but he did." Meanwhile, the family approached the security checkpoint, their composure intact despite the morning's events. The father carried his medical credentials along with their passports, while his wife kept their teenagers close, her protective instinct visible in the way she positioned herself between them and curious onlookers. The security staff straightened up as the family approached. The lead officer stepped forward, extending a professional courtesy that went beyond the usual procedural respect. "Doctor, we've been briefed about your travel today. Please follow me. We have a priority lane available for you and your family." As they moved through security, other travelers began to recognize them. A woman gasped softly and tugged her husband's sleeve. "Look, that's the surgeon from the morning news. Didn't they just feature him for that breakthrough procedure?" The blonde woman, who had followed at a distance, watched as the family received VIP treatment. She stood in the regular security line, her face burning with shame as more people around her whispered and pointed, some recognizing her from the earlier confrontations. A group of medical students waiting in line spotted the doctor and began talking excitedly among themselves. "That's him. His research paper on minimally invasive cardiac procedures changed everything. We just studied his techniques last semester." The family maintained their dignity as they moved through security, the parents ensuring their teenagers were comfortable despite the growing attention. The doctor occasionally nodded acknowledgement to those who recognized him, while his wife handled the subtle waves of recognition with practiced grace. Just then, an airport administrator hurried toward them, tablet in hand. "Doctor, Mrs. Attorney," she said warmly, "I've just been informed about what happened." I want to personally apologize for any discomfort you and your family experienced this morning. The blonde woman, now going through security herself, could hear every word as the administrator continued. Your work in our community has been invaluable. The free clinic you established has helped thousands of underprivileged patients, and your wife's legal advocacy has made our city a better place. Other passengers gathered around, some sharing personal stories of how the doctor's work had touched their lives. An elderly man stepped forward, tears in his eyes. My daughter, you operated on her 3 years ago. The other doctors had given up, but you didn't. She's getting married next month. The teenagers who had been quiet throughout the morning's events began to stand a little taller. Their initial discomfort was replaced by quiet pride as they witnessed the impact their parents had on so many lives. A news crew setting up for an unrelated story at the airport caught wind of what was happening. The reporter recognized the doctor from recent coverage of his humanitarian award and began making her way toward the family. The blonde woman, now through security, stood frozen as she watched the scene unfold. Her designer handbag hung limply at her side as she witnessed person after person approach the family with stories of gratitude and admiration. The doctor's wife noticed the news crew approaching and gently guided her family toward their gate. Despite their celebrity status, they clearly preferred to maintain their privacy and dignity rather than draw additional attention to the morning's unfortunate events. As they walked away, the administrator turned to address the gathering crowd. That family represents the very best of our community, she announced. Their work has saved countless lives and improved our city in countless ways. It's shameful that anyone would judge them based on appearance rather than character. The blonde woman slipped away, her earlier self-righteousness completely deflated. Several people recognized her as she hurried past, their disapproving glances following her retreat. Some had already posted videos of her behavior online, where the incident was quickly gaining attention. Back at the security checkpoint, the staff discussed what they had witnessed. You know what's most impressive? One officer said to his colleagues, how they handled it all with such grace. Never lost their cool, never lowered themselves to her level. The medical students who had recognized the doctor were now engaged in an animated discussion about his contributions to cardiac surgery. And did you know his wife's last case set a precedent for equal access to healthcare? One of them added. They're both literally saving lives in their own ways. The news crew, though unable to interview the family, began gathering statements from witnesses about what had occurred. The story was quickly shaping up to be more than just another airport confrontation. It was becoming a powerful lesson about prejudice, excellence, and the danger of making assumptions. Throughout the terminal, conversations turned to discussions of the family's achievements and the stark contrast between their dignity and their harassers' behavior. The incident had transformed from an ugly display of prejudice into a moment of community recognition and reflection. The airport staff member who had first spread the word about the incident checked his phone. The videos were already going viral, but not for the reason such confrontations usually did. Instead, people were sharing the story of how a family's excellence and grace had transformed an act of prejudice into a powerful teaching moment. The story behind the distinguished family began to emerge as people at the airport shared information and pulled up recent news articles on their phones. The father, it turned out, had just returned from a prestigious medical conference where he'd received a humanitarian award for his groundbreaking work. In the first-class lounge, a group of business travelers huddled around a tablet, watching a recent news segment about the doctor's innovative cardiac procedures. The report detailed how he had pioneered a new surgical technique that significantly reduced recovery time for heart patients. He could be making millions in private practice, one businessman commented, but instead, he splits his time between the hospital and running free clinics in underserved neighborhoods. His wife's achievements were equally impressive. As a civil rights attorney, she had won several landmark cases that improved access to healthcare and education in disadvantaged communities. Their teenagers, following in their parents' footsteps, had started a mentorship program at their school for younger students interested in medicine and law. The blonde woman, now sitting alone at her gate, couldn't help overhearing conversations about the family. Every new detail made her sink lower in her seat as fellow passengers discussed the incident. Did you hear about the free clinic he started? One passenger said to another. My cousin volunteers there. They treat everyone, regardless of their ability to pay. The doctor often works late into the night, making sure everyone gets care. Another passenger chimed in. His wife's last case made national news. She represented a group of families who couldn't afford life-saving treatments, won the case and got the insurance companies to change their policies, saved thousands of lives with a single verdict. The family sat quietly in the first-class lounge, trying to maintain their privacy despite the growing attention. The doctor reviewed patient files on his tablet while his wife prepared for an upcoming court case. Their teenagers worked on homework, occasionally showing their parents something on their phones. A senior airline official entered the lounge and approached their table. "Dr. Mrs. Attorney," he said respectfully, "on behalf of the airline, I want to apologize for your experience today. We have strict policies against discrimination, and we're addressing the situation." The doctor looked up from his tablet, his expression thoughtful. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but we don't want to make a bigger issue of this. Sometimes the best response to ignorance is to demonstrate excellence." His wife nodded in agreement, adding, "We've faced similar situations before. We prefer to let our work speak for itself." Their teenagers exchanged glances, clearly proud of their parents' response. The older one spoke up, "Mom and Dad always tell us to rise above negativity and focus on making a difference." The airline official was visibly moved by their gracious attitude. "Your family's contributions to our community are remarkable. Please let us know if there's anything you need during your flight." Meanwhile, in other parts of the terminal, the story continued to spread. A nurse recognized the doctor from her hospital rotation and shared how he had stayed after his shift to comfort a frightened young patient before surgery. "He treats everyone the same way," she explained to other passengers. "Rich, poor, all backgrounds, doesn't matter to him. He just wants to help people." A law student overheard and added her own story about the wife's legal work. "She guest lectured at my school last semester. Talked about using the law to create positive change. She's inspired so many of us to pursue public interest law." The blonde woman, still at her gate, pulled out her phone and began researching the family. Each article she found made her feel worse about her behavior. There were stories about the doctor performing emergency surgeries during natural disasters, his wife fighting for healthcare rights, their children organizing community service projects. A group of high school students on a field trip recognized the teenagers from a recent youth leadership conference. "They're amazing," one student told their teacher. "They started a program helping kids from tough neighborhoods get into medical and law schools. They're like their parents, always thinking about others." The airport staff, impressed by how the family handled the situation, discussed it during their break. "You know what stands out?" one said. "They could have made a huge scene, gotten that woman banned from flying. Instead, they showed pure class." Back in the lounge, the doctor received an urgent message about a patient. Without hesitation, he began making calls, coordinating with his team at the hospital. His wife supported him quietly, helping him organize his schedule while managing her own caseload. Their children watched their parents work, witnessing firsthand how they balanced their successful careers with compassion and dignity. The morning's incident, while unpleasant, had become another lesson in handling adversity with grace. As departure time approached, more passengers recognized the family from various contexts: hospital visits, legal proceedings, community events. Each had a story about how this family had touched their lives or the lives of others. The incident had transformed into something unexpected. Instead of being just another story about discrimination, it had become a powerful example of how excellence, dedication, and grace could overcome prejudice and ignorance. The terminal buzzed with energy as more passengers began sharing their personal experiences with the doctor and his family. A small crowd had gathered near the first-class lounge, people taking turns telling their stories. An elderly woman dabbed at her eyes as she spoke to fellow passengers. "Last year, no other doctor would take my case. They said I was too old for the surgery, but he didn't just operate on me. He visited every day during my recovery, explaining everything to my grandchildren." A young teacher joined the conversation. His wife helped our school district secure funding for special education programs. She worked pro bono for months. Now hundreds of children have access to resources they desperately needed. The blonde woman, who had switched to a different gate to avoid the growing crowd, couldn't escape the ripple effect of her actions. Passengers walking past pointed and whispered, some recording videos on their phones. The incident was spreading rapidly across social media platforms. A group of nurses from a nearby hospital recognized the doctor from their rounds. "He's incredible in the operating room," one explained to curious listeners. But what really sets him apart is how he treats everyone, from the janitors to the chief of surgery, with the same respect. Inside the lounge, the family tried to maintain their routine despite the attention. The teenagers worked on their homework while their father handled an urgent consultation call from the hospital. Their mother reviewed case files, occasionally glancing at her children with a protective eye. A flight attendant approached their table with tears in her eyes. "Doctor, you operated on my father last month. The other surgeons had given up hope, but you—" She paused, composing herself. "He's walking again, playing with his grandchildren." The doctor smiled warmly, genuinely pleased to hear about his patient's recovery. "That's wonderful news. Remember to tell him to stick to his rehabilitation schedule." Outside the lounge, more stories emerged. A maintenance worker shared how the doctor had established a scholarship fund for hospital staff's children. A legal intern described how the attorney had mentored minority law students, helping them navigate career challenges. The blonde woman, increasingly uncomfortable with the attention, tried to hide behind a magazine at her gate. But the stories kept coming, each one revealing another layer of the family's impact on their community. A young man in medical scrubs spoke up. "I was failing out of medical school, ready to quit. The doctor took me under his wing, spent extra hours teaching me. Now I'm finishing my residency. He didn't just save patients, he helped create new doctors." Social media was ablaze with the incident. Videos of the confrontation were being shared alongside news articles about the family's achievements. The contrast between the woman's prejudice and the family's grace became a powerful talking point. A community organizer recognized the teenagers from their volunteer work. "Those kids spend their weekends tutoring at-risk youth," she told others. "They could be doing typical teenage things, but they choose to give back." The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. The airport staff had to manage the growing crowd of well-wishers and supporters. People kept approaching the lounge, hoping to express their gratitude or share their stories. The family's impact on the community was far greater than anyone had realized. A hospital administrator who happened to be traveling that day provided context for the doctor's recent award. He developed a program that brings advanced cardiac care to rural areas. People who would never have access to this level of treatment are now getting life-saving procedures. The blonde woman's face burned as she overheard someone reading from a news article about the wife's recent legal victory. She won a case that made healthcare more accessible for thousands of families. The judge cited her work as transformative to the community. Inside the lounge, the family remained focused on their work and each other, handling the situation with characteristic grace. The teenagers occasionally shared encouraging smiles with their parents, their bond strengthened by the morning's events. A gate agent approached the lounge to inform them that boarding would begin soon. She added quietly, "My sister was a patient in your free clinic last year, doctor. What you've built there, it's changing lives." The incident had evolved beyond a simple story of prejudice confronted. It had become a moment of community recognition, a chance for people to acknowledge how one family's dedication to service had touched countless lives. As boarding time approached, the family gathered their belongings, moving with the same quiet dignity they had displayed throughout the morning. Their response to ignorance hadn't been anger or retaliation, but rather a continued commitment to their work and values. The blonde woman sat alone at her gate, watching her phone as social media exploded with videos of her behavior. The morning's events had forced her to confront her prejudices in a way she never expected. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through comments condemning her actions and praising the family's dignified response. Through the terminal windows, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the waiting areas. The woman noticed people giving her sideways glances, some shaking their heads in disapproval. The weight of her actions pressed heavily on her conscience. A cleaning staff member who was tidying nearby spoke quietly to another passenger. "That doctor saved my mother's life last year. When we couldn't afford the full treatment, he worked with the hospital to reduce the costs. He even checked on her personally every day." The woman's eyes filled with tears as she listened to more stories about the family, Each new revelation twisted the knife of shame deeper. She thought about her own children and how she would feel if someone treated them the way she had treated this family. Meanwhile, at the first-class gate, the family prepared for boarding. The father had just finished a phone consultation with his hospital team while his wife was wrapping up some legal paperwork. Their teenagers sat close by, the morning's events having drawn them even closer as a family. A gate agent made an announcement. "We'll begin boarding our first-class passengers in a few moments." She paused, then added more quietly to her colleague, "That's the doctor who treated my cousin's heart condition. Insurance wouldn't cover it, but he found a way to help." The blonde woman could no longer bear sitting still. She stood up and, gathering what remained of her courage, walked slowly toward the first-class gate. Her designer heels, which had clicked so confidently earlier, now seemed to whisper shame with each step. As she approached the family, other passengers watched intently. Some raised their phones, expecting another confrontation. Instead, they witnessed something unexpected. I need to apologize," she said, her voice cracking. "My behavior was inexcusable. I let my prejudices blind me, and I'm deeply ashamed." Tears rolled down her cheeks as she spoke. The doctor and his wife exchanged glances. The teenagers looked up from their phones, watching the scene unfold. The woman continued, "I've spent the last hour learning about your family's contributions to our community. I'm horrified by how I acted." The father spoke first, his voice gentle but firm. "Thank you for your apology. It takes courage to admit when we're wrong." His wife nodded in agreement, adding, "We hope this can be a learning experience for everyone involved." The woman wiped her eyes, smudging her expensive mascara. "I've learned more than you know. My own daughter wants to be a doctor, and here I was, judging someone who represents everything she should aspire to be." Around them, passengers and airport staff watched the interaction with interest. Some were still recording, but now they were capturing a different kind of moment, one of humility, forgiveness, and growth. The doctor's wife spoke softly, "Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth. What matters is what we learn from them." Their teenagers, who had remained quiet throughout the exchange, showed remarkable maturity. The older one offered a small smile, while the younger one nodded in acknowledgement of the woman's courage to apologize. Just then, the boarding announcement came over the speakers. The family gathered their belongings, preparing to board. The woman stepped back, giving them space, but the doctor paused. "If your daughter is interested in medicine," he said, handing her his card, "have her contact my office. We'd have a mentorship program for aspiring medical students." Fresh tears welled up in the woman's eyes at this unexpected kindness. The wife added, "And we offer legal internships for students interested in civil rights law. Everyone deserves a chance to learn and grow." As the family boarded their flight, other passengers couldn't help but notice how they had transformed an ugly incident into a teachable moment. They had met prejudice not with anger, but with grace and wisdom. The blonde woman stood watching them leave, the doctor's card clutched in her hand. She had arrived at the airport that morning full of prejudice and self-importance. She would leave it with valuable lessons about judgment, humility, and the power of forgiveness. Around her, people began sharing the new development on social media. The story was no longer just about confrontation, it had become a powerful message about redemption and the possibility of change. In the days that followed, the airport incident took on a life of its own. The video had gone viral, but not in the way most confrontational videos do. Instead, it became a powerful story about prejudice, grace, and transformation. The doctor's office received hundreds of calls and emails from people sharing their own experiences with discrimination and asking how they could help support the free clinics. His wife's law firm was flooded with offers from other attorneys wanting to volunteer their time for civil rights cases. Local news stations picked up the story, focusing not on the initial confrontation but on the family's remarkable response. One reporter interviewed hospital staff who shared stories about the doctor's dedication to his patients. "He treats everyone the same," said a nurse who had worked with him for years. "Rich or poor, all backgrounds, in his eyes, they're all just people who need help. And he never turns anyone away." The blonde woman's moment of redemption became an equally important part of the narrative. Her public apology and the family's gracious response resonated with viewers. People commented on how rare it was to see someone acknowledge their prejudices and commit to changing them. A week after the incident, she sat in her living room with her teenage daughter, watching a news segment about the doctor's free clinic program. "Mom," her daughter said quietly, "I called the number on his card. I'm starting volunteer work at the clinic next weekend." The woman smiled through tears, remembering how close she had come to teaching her daughter the wrong lessons about judging others. Instead, her public mistake had become a powerful teaching moment. The doctor's teenagers had also been changed by the experience. At their school, they started a diversity awareness program, sharing their family's story and encouraging open discussions about prejudice and understanding. "Our parents taught us that the best response to ignorance isn't anger," the older teenager explained to their classmates. "It's excellence and grace." The incident sparked important conversations in unexpected places. Companies used it in their diversity training programs. Schools incorporated it into their character education curriculum. Religious leaders referenced it in their sermons about forgiveness and growth. At the hospital, the doctor continued his work as usual, spending extra hours with patients who needed him. But now, more young medical students sought him out as a mentor, inspired by how he had handled the airport confrontation. His wife's law firm saw an increase in applications from minority students interested in civil rights law. "We want to make a difference like she does," one applicant wrote, "not just by winning cases, but by showing dignity in the face of prejudice." The blonde woman made good on her promise to change. She joined a community outreach program and began volunteering at local diversity initiatives. Her story of transformation encouraged others to examine their own biases. 3 months after the incident, she attended a fundraiser for the doctor's free clinic program. When they saw each other across the room, both smiled. Her daughter was there too, proudly wearing a volunteer badge. "You know what amazes me most?" the woman said to another volunteer. "They could have made the story about my bad behavior. Instead, they made it about hope and change." The doctor's wife had used the incident to push for stronger anti-discrimination policies at airports. But she did it quietly, without seeking publicity or revenge. "Real change," she often said, "comes from education and understanding, not from punishment." Their teenagers had grown from the experience too. They started mentoring younger students, teaching them how to handle difficult situations with grace. "Our parents showed us that your response to prejudice shapes who you become," the younger one explained in a school speech. 6 months later, the family attended a national medical conference where the doctor was giving a keynote speech. He spoke about medical innovations and healthcare accessibility, but he also addressed the airport incident. "That day reminded us that excellence is the best response to prejudice," he told the audience. "But it also showed us that people can change when we give them the chance." The story continued to impact lives in subtle ways. Airport staff reported fewer incidents of discrimination. More medical students volunteered at free clinics. Law students showed increased interest in civil rights cases. But perhaps the most significant change was in countless private moments when people caught themselves making assumptions about others and remembered the lesson they had learned from that viral video. The family had transformed an ugly moment of prejudice into a lasting message of hope. They had shown that the right response to ignorance isn't always anger or revenge. Sometimes it's simply showing others a better way forward. As the doctor often said when asked about that day, "We didn't just change one person's mind. We showed everyone watching that change is possible, and that's what matters most." The end of this story marked the beginning of many others, as people continued to learn from and be inspired by a family who chose to meet prejudice with grace, ignorance with excellence, and hatred with hope.